She stumbled into the drift, snow clawing at her skirts, lungs burning with air too sharp to breathe, and in the hollow of her chest she carried only one wish, that the white silence would bury her for good. "Please, let me die alone," her mind repeated, though her lips cracked the words against the wind, vanishing before they reached the sky. Behind her, hooves hammered the frozen trail, men shouting, their voices cruel and eager, the suitor who had bought her contract from the east, demanding she crawl back to him like chattel. Her legs buckled. The world tilted. She fell against a half-buried stump, clutching at the frozen bark as though it might open into a grave. Then came the crunch of heavier boots, not hurried like the riders, but steady, deliberate, cutting through storm like the beat of a drum. She tried to turn her face away, tried to hold to her prayer for death, but a shadow fell across her, broad and unyielding, fur-lined coat rimmed with ice. He did not ask permission. His arms closed around her with the strength of a man used to dragging carcasses from snare lines, and in a single lift, she was torn from the snow. She pressed a broken breath against his chest, the smell of smoke and pine thick in the furs, and struggled with the little strength left to her. "Leave me," she whispered inside, but her fists only tangled weakly in his coat. He carried her as though her refusal were nothing more than another flake in the blizzard. The wind roared, drowning the voices of the men behind, and she realized dimly that his pace angled away from the trail into timber where no hoof could follow. Her head dropped against his shoulder, hair freezing in strands across her cheek, and she caught the sound of his breathing. Deep, even, unshaken, as if carrying a woman through death's teeth was no burden at all. Once, in some other life, she might have called him rescuer. Tonight she cursed him for denying her the one mercy she thought she had left. His boots struck stone, then timber underfoot, and she saw through half-shut eyes the lean outline of a cabin rising out of drifts, smoke curling faint from the chimney like a promise she had not asked for. He shouldered the door, wood groaning as it yielded, and warmth struck her face so suddenly she wept from the sting. The man set her down not on a bed of snow, but on a bearskin laid thick across the floor. Her limbs shook with exhaustion, heart rattling in her ribs, but still she tried to rise, to crawl back out, to find the storm again. His hand pressed her shoulder, not rough but final, and for the first time his voice broke the silence, low and gravel-deep. "Die later if you want. Not in my snow." She stared at him, wide-eyed, lips parted, no reply found in her frozen throat. The fire popped in the hearth, scattering sparks like stars across the dark, and she realized she was no longer asking for death. She was only waiting for whatever this stranger had decided survival meant. Outside, the storm howled against the logs, but inside, the cabin sealed her fate with smoke, heat, and a heartbeat too steady to let her vanish. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine sap, heavy enough to make her chest ache, and though her body screamed for the storm again, her limbs betrayed her. Her, refusing to move from the bearskin where the mountain man had set her down. He moved without a word, throwing kindling into the hearth, stirring the coals until flame licked up the stone and cast the room in copper light. She thought of the men still out there, their shouts buried by the storm, and part of her prayed they would break through first, not him. Because death, she understood. But this silent stranger's choice to keep her alive was something sharper. He crossed the room in 3 steps, his boots leaving wet scars on the boards, and pressed a tin mug into her hands. The broth inside trembled, steam rising in curls, and she stared at it as if it were poison. "Drink," he said, his voice rough like a door that had not been opened in years. She wanted to spit it back, wanted to prove she had not begged for life, But her throat betrayed her, and the broth slid down, hot enough to burn away the edges of frost lodged there. He knelt, close enough that the firelight carved lines into his face, and she saw grief there, deep as the mountains that had hidden him. He asked no questions, not her name, not her story, not why her skirts were torn and her shoes cracked. Instead, he dragged a fur blanket from a chest and laid it across her shoulders as though shielding her from the storm was no more unusual than setting a snare. Her mind screamed that she could not stay, that the men outside would not stop until she was dragged back to the suitor who had paid for her like stock, but her body curled tighter into the warmth, traitor to her resolve. Her eyes flicked to the corner where a carved cradle sat, cedar wood polished smooth, its inside empty, and her breath caught at the thought that once this place had been built for more than one man alone. The stranger's eyes followed hers for only a heartbeat before he turned away, the set of his shoulders tightening, and she knew then that he had buried something too. A scrape sounded against the door, wind, or maybe more than wind, and the wolfish growl that answered from outside made her stomach knot. She looked to him, expecting alarm, but he only said, "The storm keeps worse things away," as though he trusted the blizzard more than men. She pulled the blanket tighter, lips parting, words forming against her will. "Why didn't you leave me?" He turned, and for the first time, their eyes locked, his dark and steady against the tremor in hers. "Because I know what it looks like when someone wants death more than breath," he said, voice flat, "and I won't watch it again." She wanted to ask again to whom, but her mouth closed around silence, because the way his hand hovered near the cradle gave her the answer she feared. The fire spat sparks, the storm groaned against the timbers, and though her body still begged to lie down in the snow, she felt her heart beat, hitch with a new and dangerous thought, that maybe survival was no longer hers to decide. The storm had eased to a muffled hush by the time she could hear her own breath again, but the silence pressed thicker than any wind. She sat near the fire with the blanket drawn to her chin, the broth settling warm in her stomach, though her heart remained sharp and cold. The mountain man, Colt, she had heard him call himself when he cursed at the latch sticking on the window, stood with his back to her, sharpening a short axe across a whetstone, the sound scraping steady as a heartbeat. She watched his shoulders move, broad and slow, and wondered if he even remembered she was there, or if carrying women from the snow was something he did out of habit. She closed her eyes, tried to will herself into nothing, but a sound outside snapped them open again, a spur striking stone, faint but too clean to be the storm. Her stomach twisted. They had found the cabin. She rose halfway, blanket falling, but Colt lifted one hand without turning and said, "Sit." His voice carried no edge, just certainty, and the command rooted her to the floorboards even as fear burned through her veins. He crossed to the shutter, pulled it open a crack, and she saw the flicker of torchlight weaving through the trees. Riders, not lost, not dead. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth, fighting back the sob that wanted to tear free, because she knew what they wanted and how easily men like that would break down a door. Colt shut the shutter again, jaw tightening. "They're not gone," he said, though she hadn't asked. She told him then, words tumbling out against her will, about the suitor who had bought her contract, about the men he sent to fetch her when she ran, about the nights she had prayed to disappear rather than be touched by him again. Her voice cracked, and she said she only wanted to die, that dragging her here had cheated her of the only mercy left. Colt's face shifted. Not pity, not anger, but something darker. He turned to the cedar cradle in the corner, ran his hand across its rim once, and said, "I carried another once, one who begged the same. She didn't make it. The words fell like stones into the silence. The cradle creaked faintly, though no child lay in it, and the sound crawled into her chest. She realized then that the twist she had not seen was not outside at all. It was in this room, in this man who bore grief like armor. He had not saved her out of chance. He had pulled her in because her plea echoed another he had already buried. Outside, the torchlight grew brighter, closer, and she knew the riders would not wait for dawn. Colt set the axe down, steady hands though his eyes had gone fierce. "You asked to die alone," he said, voice quiet. "But the mountain doesn't listen. And neither do I." She flinched, torn between terror of the men outside and terror of what living might now mean. The wolf dog scratched at the door, restless, its growl a low warning. She clutched the blanket tighter, her body caught in the impossible truth. She had begged for death, but the storm had handed her something else entirely. Life inside a cabin haunted by ghosts, with danger pressing at every wall. The knock rattled the frame like a rifle shot, 3 heavy blows that shook dust from the rafters. The wolf dog barked once, sharp and guttural, then planted itself against the door with hackles raised. She clutched the blanket close, heat from the fire now feeling like a lie, every nerve straining toward the sound of men outside. Colt moved without hurry, setting the axe against the wall, pulling down a rifle from the pegs above the hearth. His movements were practiced, not rushed, the way a man sharpened by loss carries himself when danger was already part of his marrow. She whispered that they would kill her, drag her back, that he had no reason to fight for someone already marked. He glanced at her only briefly, face unreadable, and said, "I don't fight for you. I fight because they crossed my door." Then the door shuddered under a boot, wood groaning, snow puffing in through the split seam. Her son's face. No, not her son. She caught herself, her mind slipping into a memory that wasn't hers but must have been his, the child he had buried, flashed through her mind at the sight of the cradle rocking empty in the corner. Another crash. Louder, the beam cracking. Colt raised the rifle, aimed low, and when the door splintered wide enough for a boot to punch through, he fired. The report shook the cabin, smoke rolling thick, and a man outside screamed as snow swallowed him. Silence followed for one thin heartbeat, then curses, gunfire slamming against the logs, chips of wood flying like hornets. She dropped flat against the floor, hands clamped over her ears, but Colt didn't flinch, working the rifle smooth, each shot deliberate. Between volleys, he barked a single command. "Stay down." She pressed her cheek to the boards, heart a drum in her chest, the wolf dog snarling each time a shadow crossed the broken seam, the smell of powder mixed with pine sap and smoke, choking her throat. A torch landed on the snow just outside, sputtering, then another, brighter, closer. They meant to burn them out. Colt cursed low, set the rifle aside, grabbed the axe, and in one motion ripped the door wide open. The storm hadn't died. It had only been waiting. Wind shrieked into the cabin, dragging snow across the floor, blinding her. Through it she saw his shape, broad and defiant in the doorway, axe in one hand, the wolf dog lunging at his side. The riders shouted in alarm, horses rearing against the sudden blast of cold. Colt moved like the mountain itself had taken flesh, swinging hard, knocking the nearest man from his saddle. She wanted to crawl forward, to shut the door, to hide, but her body was frozen between terror and awe. The storm swallowed the scene in white, the torchlight flickering out, men retreating back into trees. Colt slammed the door shut again, snow still clinging to his beard, breath steady though blood dripped from a cut across his temple. He dropped the bar back in place, set the axe aside, and only then let his shoulders sag. The Wolfdog paced, restless, ears twitching at the night. She sat up slowly, body trembling, eyes wide on him. He didn't look at her, only at the cradle. "They'll come again," he said, voice flat. This was just the start. And she knew then that safety was a lie, that the cabin was not a refuge but a battlefield waiting to be claimed by dawn. The night did not return to silence. Outside, the storm ground on like a beast chewing bone, and between its howls came the jagged notes of men regrouping. Snapped reins, muffled curses, boots crunching across ice. She huddled against the hearth, blanket drawn to her chin, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door as though it might breathe and split again. Colt wiped blood from his temple with the back of his hand, the red streak bright against his rough skin, then checked the rifle with slow, deliberate motions. The wolfdog prowled the boards, tail stiff, claws clicking like clock hands marking down the seconds to another strike. She whispered that they should flee, vanish into the timber before the riders circled back, but Colt's jaw only tightened. The mountain swallows runaways. If we leave, it's their storm, not ours. His words pressed like iron, final and immovable. The next blow against the door came sudden, shaking the beam, snow showering from the rafters. A pistol shot followed, splintering the wood, the ball ricocheting into the cradle and leaving a deep scar across the carved cedar. Her cry broke loose before she could choke it back, grief raw for a child who had never lain there. Colt's gaze snapped to the cradle, and something flickered across his face. Rage, grief, she couldn't tell which. He set the rifle aside and lifted the axe instead. The next crash tore the bar half free, and this time a rider's arm shoved through, groping for the latch. The wolfdog lunged, teeth closing over flesh, dragging a scream from the man outside. Colt swung the axe down, clean and brutal, the sound of bone and wood breaking together. Blood sprayed across the threshold, dark against snow, and the arm went limp. For a breath, only silence. Then shouts rose in fury, and she knew more were about to storm through. Colt yanked the door fully open before they could, dragging the body inward and shoving it aside, then stepped out into the night with the axe raised. She saw him for a heartbeat in torchlight, the silhouette of a man who belonged to storms more than hearths. And then the clash erupted. Steel on steel, curses cut short, snow churned into mud. The wolfdog darted past her legs, launching itself after him. She pressed her palms to the floor, fighting the instinct to crawl into the cradle's shadow, and instead staggered upright, seizing the iron poker from the hearth. Her hands shook, but when another rider shoved through the half-broken frame, pistol aimed at her chest, she swung with all the terror burning through her. The red-hot iron cracked against his wrist, his gun clattering to the floor as he howled and stumbled back into the storm. Colt's axe followed, splitting the cry into silence. For a moment she stood frozen, chest heaving, the poker trembling in her grip, the smell of blood and smoke thick around her. Colt's eyes found hers across the chaos, something fierce and unspoken passing between them. Then more hoofbeats thundered down from the ridge, echoing off stone, and she understood this fight was not ending. It was growing. Colt shoved the door shut, chest heaving, beard crusted with snow, and leaned the axe against the frame. "This threshold is theirs now," he said, voice like gravel ground to dust. "We'll have to take the mountain itself to break them." She clutched the poker tighter, breath ragged, and for the first time she did not whisper to be left to die. She whispered only, "Then show me how." They left the cabin before dawn, the fire little more than ash, smoke clinging to their clothes as if reluctant to release them. Colt dragged a rope sled behind him, his movements slow but steady, the axe strapped across his back. She walked close, the blanket bound tight around her shoulders, the infant hidden in its folds of heat, though every step rattled her bones as if the cold meant to hollow her from within. The wolf dog trotted ahead, pausing now and then to look back, its yellow eyes bright in the dim light, urging them faster. Her son? No, she reminded herself, not her son, but the boy in her mind that wasn't hers, haunted her every glance at the cradle scarred by a bullet. The storm had thinned, leaving the air brittle and sharp, so quiet she could hear her own blood rush in her ears. Behind them, the sound of riders carried faintly through timber, proof that the night's slaughter had not broken their will. Colt's voice cut low through the hush. The mountain's weight waits above the bluff. One shout, one wrong step, and it all comes down. Best we aim the fall ourselves. She wanted to ask what that meant, what he intended, but the set of his shoulders kept her silence. They climbed until the trees broke open onto a ridge, the land dropping steep and white beneath, snow stacked in heavy shelves that quivered under their boots. Colt pulled her close to a rock outcrop, tucking her and the child behind it. When they crest, stay down. Don't move until the ground moves first, he said. His voice carried no doubt, only command. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She wanted to beg him not to leave her, not to walk into the storm again, but her lips pressed shut because she knew begging had no place here anymore. Colt stepped onto the ridge, his figure black against the white, each stride purposeful, daring. He raised the axe high and bellowed once, a raw sound that rolled like thunder across the hollow. Below, the riders' shouts spiked, and their horses lurched forward, silhouettes weaving through pines. She clutched the child to her chest and pressed her back into the stone, the wolf dog pressed tight beside her, low growl vibrating through her ribs. The first rider burst from the trees, torch raised, light shaking across the slope. Then another, and another. Colt stood waiting, broad as the ridge itself, unmoving as they drove their mounts higher. The snow beneath them groaned, a sound that made her stomach seize. One horse reared, its hooves crashing down, and the shelf cracked with a sound like a tree splitting. Colt swung the axe into the drift, carving deep, and the ridge answered with a roar that shook the marrow in her bones. White thunder surged, the mountain peeling free in a wave of snow and stone, swallowing riders and horses alike, their cries strangled under the rush. She held the infant tighter, her breath locked in her throat as the avalanche tore downward, wiping the hollow clean. For a heartbeat, silence. Then she saw Colt's boots slide, his axe buried into the ice, his body straining against the pull. Her scream ripped free, raw and sharp, as the snow tried to claim him too. He hung there at the edge, one arm clinging, the other slipping, the storm's judgment waiting to decide whether to spare him or bury him with the men he had damned. The avalanche's roar collapsed into a hush so deep it felt like the earth itself had gone deaf. Snow drifted back to the ridge in slow, ghost-like sheets, erasing every trace of the riders, their torches, their cries. She clutched the infant so hard the child whimpered, and only then did her lungs remember to drag air in. The wolf dog had already lunged forward, its paws tearing into the edge where Colt had vanished, whining low and sharp. She scrambled after it, the blanket dragging, her knees sinking deep. Her hands clawed into the drift until her nails tore, icy grit searing her skin. But the mountain gave nothing back. Panic gnawed her chest raw. Colt. The name ripped out of her before she knew she owned it, echoing over the hollow like a prayer too late. The wolf dog barked once, frantic, then thrust its muzzle into a patch where the snow quivered faintly, throwing up plumes with its paws. She fell beside it, scraping and digging, her breath ragged sobs. Then, there, a fragment of leather, the edge of his coat. She dug until her arms burned, until blood smeared the snow, until at last a hand broke free, limp, white, too still. She seized it with both of hers, sobbing, tugging, screaming his name again. For a breath he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then his chest convulsed, a ragged gasp tearing through blue lips, spitting ice and blood together. Relief shattered her into tears, hot and bitter against her frozen cheeks. She leaned close, whispering through sobs, "Breathe, you stubborn fool, breathe." His eyelids fluttered, eyes glazed, unfocused, but alive. She and the wolf dog dragged at him, hauling until he lay sprawled clear of the ridge, his body shaking with every shallow cough. The child whimpered in her arms, and she tucked the infant beneath her cloak again, whispering nonsense just to keep herself from breaking apart. Colt's voice rasped weak, barely a thread. Storm took them. She pressed her hands to his chest, forcing warmth into him, eyes burning. "Storm nearly took you," she said, though her voice shook too hard to sound angry. He closed his eyes, but a faint sound, almost like a laugh, slipped between his teeth, bitter and worn. She bent lower, ear near his lips, terrified of silence. His words came slow, halting. "Mountain doesn't want me yet." The wolf dog whined, pressing its head against his shoulder, as if agreeing with the mountain's decision. She held him there, rocking slightly as though he were another child to soothe, the avalanche's grave yawning behind them. For the first time since she had begged to be left in the snow, she felt the truth of her own body, how every fiber wanted him alive, how her heart had betrayed her despair by choosing him. She brushed snow from his face with trembling fingers, memorizing the harsh lines carved there, the man who had refused her prayer for death. The storm began to fade, light pressing faint gold against the peaks, and though the world was still broken open, her chest steadied with a vow unspoken. If the mountain had spared him, she would not waste what it had returned. She would not beg for death again, not with him beside her, breath dragging stubborn from his chest. They staggered back to the cabin in silence, her shoulder beneath his arm, the wolf dog pacing close, its nose brushing his hand as if to keep him tethered. Colt's weight dragged at her with every step, but she refused to yield, each pace carved from will alone. By the time the cabin door closed behind them, her legs shook so violently she dropped to her knees, pulling him down with her onto the bear skin. The fire had nearly died, only ash glowing faintly, but she crawled to the hearth, shaking hands, fumbling with flint and steel until sparks caught, and flame rose sharp and hungry. The light washed across Colt's face, pale and hollow, his beard crusted with ice, eyes half-lidded. She pressed broth to his lips, her own trembling spilling half down his chin, whispering nonsense just to keep sound alive between them. He swallowed once, a weak cough, then rasped. "Should have let the storm keep me." She gripped his collar, eyes burning, and said in a voice rougher than she knew she had, "I begged for death and you wouldn't let me. Don't dare speak of giving up now." His gaze flicked to her, tired but sharp, as if her defiance carved something clean into him. He lay back, chest rattling, while the wolf dog curled along his legs, its body heat soaking into him. She tucked the blanket higher, held the infant against her chest, then reached for the cradle, dragging it closer though it stood empty. Her hand traced the scar left by the bullet, the groove across the cedar, and she whispered that he had lost once, that she had lost too, but maybe loss was not the end if both of them still drew breath. His eyes followed her hand, and the silence stretched heavy until he spoke. That cradle was built for a daughter who never woke. Every night I told myself the storm would take me next. Then I heard you in the snow, begging for death, same as she did. I couldn't watch it again." His voice cracked, the words breaking like wood under strain. She pressed her palm to the scarred rim, heart hammering with the weight of his confession, and whispered, "Then let me bargain with you. If you refuse to let me die, then I refuse to let you live as if you already have." His eyes closed, but his hand lifted, rough fingers fumbling until they found hers. His grip was weak, yet it bound tighter than chains. The fire flared, throwing sparks that climbed the chimney, and for the first time the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a place waiting to be lived in. The wolf dog sighed, head dropping heavy against Colt's thigh, the sound low and final, as if the mountain itself had offered its approval. She leaned forward, forehead against Colt's hand, breath catching. "We're not ghosts yet," she whispered. "Not you, not me, not tonight." His chest rose, shaky but steady, and a faint smile traced his lips, brittle but real. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying not the scream of the storm, but the softer hush of snow settling, a truce whispered by the mountain. And she knew then that survival was no longer an accident. It was a choice she and this broken man had made together, bound by firelight and a cradle scarred but unbroken. The fire had barely settled into a steady crackle when the wolf dog lifted its head, ears pricked, throat rumbling with a low growl that turned the cabin's warmth brittle. She froze, her hand still wrapped around Colt's, the infant pressed tight against her chest. Outside, beyond the hush of falling snow, came a sound too deliberate to be the mountain, boots crunching, horses snorting, voices muffled but near. Her stomach clenched. The avalanche had swallowed most, but not all. Colt stirred, trying to rise, but his body betrayed him, sagging back against the bear skin. He spat a curse, bitter, and whispered, "They'll finish it this time." She shook her head hard, a sharp breath leaving her lungs. "Not while I breathe." The words surprised even her, but once spoken they felt carved in stone. She eased Colt back, pulled the blanket tighter over him, then seized the iron poker from the hearth. Her hands trembled, but she gripped it until the skin went white, the heat searing through her palm. The first blow rattled the door. Calculated, not desperate, as if the men knew their prey was weak now. Another came, wood splintering further from the night's earlier scars. The wolf dog braced itself, teeth bared, ready. She pressed her back to the cradle, the scar across its rim cutting a dark shadow in the firelight, and told herself she would not let another bullet find it. "Stay with me," Colt rasped from the floor, his voice cracked but steady. She glanced at him, saw the fire reflecting in his eyes, and nodded once. The door shuddered again, then split, and two figures forced through, faces half buried in scarves, eyes gleaming with hunger and hate. One raised a pistol toward the hearth. Before she thought, she swung the poker, sparks flying as it cracked against his arm, the weapon clattering useless to the floor. The wolf dog launched into the second, teeth sinking into his coat, dragging him down in a snarl of limbs. She screamed with the force of terror turned rage, driving the hot iron into the first man's chest. His cry split the cabin, raw and ragged, before he collapsed against the boards. Blood pooled across the threshold, soaking into snow tracked in on his boots. The second thrashed, trying to shake the wolf dog free, but Colt's voice cut through the chaos. "Move him!" She kicked with all her strength, sending the rider sprawling against the wall, and the wolf dog tore free, lunging again with renewed fury. Colt struggled upright, his hand fumbling for the axe, dragging it across the floor until the blade caught the firelight. He lifted it high, and with one last surge of will he brought it down, silencing the man forever. The cabin stank of blood, smoke, and fear. her chest heaving with every ragged breath. She stood shaking, the poker still clutched, staring at the bodies sprawled across the boards. The wolf dog licked blood from its muzzle, then lay down by the door, panting. Colt slumped back, spent, the axe sliding from his hand. His eyes met hers, not fierce now, but full of something she could not name, something that made her knees weak. She dropped the poker at last, fell against the cradle, clutching the child tighter. The scar in the cedar caught her eye again, and she whispered to herself that they had carved their survival into it, that the cradle would never be empty again. Colt's voice rasped, softer this time. "It's done. The mountain's taken the last of them." She turned to him, eyes burning with tears, and answered, "Then let the mountain keep its dead. We're still alive." But in her chest, she felt the truth trembling. Life had become more dangerous than death, because now it meant she had something she could not afford to lose. The storm broke at last, its rage spent, leaving a silence so wide it pressed against her ears. Dawn seeped pale and gold across the valley, painting the snow in hues that almost looked gentle. She stood in the cabin doorway, the infant wrapped tight against her chest, her body aching from battle and burden, but her legs steady beneath her. The wolf dog lay at her feet, muzzle on its paws, eyes half shut yet alert. The faint rise and fall of its chest proof that even beasts could survive a night drenched in blood. Behind her, Colt stirred on the bearskin, propped against the wall, his breath rough but deeper than it had been, the gray of exhaustion cut by a flicker of fire in his eyes. She looked back once, saw him watching her in the dawn light, and for the first time she didn't see a recluse or a shadow-haunted man. She saw someone who had dragged her from the edge of death and bound her to life with his refusal. Her gaze fell to the cedar cradle, scarred but unbroken, standing sentinel in the corner. She walked to it slowly, placed the child inside, and laid her hand across the carved rim, fingers tracing the groove left by a bullet. The cradle rocked faintly as the baby stirred, a soft whimper filling the space, fragile and alive. Her throat tightened with the realization that this was what the storm had spared, the chance to place life where death had once taken root. Colt's voice came from behind her, quiet, raw. "That cradle wasn't meant to be empty. I built it for a daughter who never saw the spring. Thought it would rot with me." He paused, breath shuddering. "But it's not empty now." She turned, met his gaze, and saw something fragile in his steadiness, the faint tremor of a man daring to want again. She crossed the floor, knelt beside him, and pressed his rough hand into hers. "You carried me when I begged for the storm. You carried my child when I had no strength left." "I won't let that mean nothing," she whispered, her voice breaking but firm. His hand tightened around hers, weak but certain. "Then stay," he said simply. No demand in it, just an offering. The words lodged deep inside her, not as command but as shelter. She nodded, her tears hot against the cold morning air, and leaned against him, the weight of her body against his proof that she was choosing life, not begging for death. Outside, the valley stretched endless, scarred by avalanche, silent with the graves of men who had tried to claim what wasn't theirs. The mountain had kept them. The mountain had spared her. The wolf dog barked once at the rising sun, its torn ear catching the light like a banner, then settled again, a guardian content. She closed her eyes, listening to Colt's unsteady breathing, the faint creak of the cradle as the child shifted, the fire crackling in its slow rhythm. And she knew the storm had not been her ending. It had been the forge. The valley was still cruel, still vast, still filled with men who would take if given the chance. Inside this cabin, on this dawn, she held a truth no storm could strip away. She had begged to be left in the snow, but she had been carried instead. And what had been carried was no longer just survival. It was family, bound by blood spilled, breath spared, and a cradle rocking softly into the light.